The last time anyone saw James Whitmore, he was standing outside Pemberton's Curiosities on Aldgate Street, checking his watch and frowning at the rain. It was 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in November, the sort of gray London day that made even the most cheerful soul consider emigration to somewhere warmer. Eleanor Whitmore had been married to James for 8 years, and she knew his habits better than he knew them himself. Tuesday afternoons meant a visit to the antiquarian bookshops along Aldgate, a ritual he'd maintained since university. He'd ring her at 4:30 sharp to say he was heading home, usually with some dusty volume tucked under his arm and a story about the eccentric dealer who'd sold it to him. The call never came. By 6 o'clock, Eleanor was pacing their Bloomsbury flat, her mobile pressed to her ear as James's voicemail message played for the 7th time. By 8, she'd called his office, his brother, and 3 separate hospitals. By 10, she was standing in the local police station, trying to explain to a bored constable that her husband wasn't the sort to simply vanish. "Perhaps he's having a bit of a crisis, love," the officer suggested, not unkindly. Men his age, they sometimes need a bit of space to think things through. Eleanor wanted to throw something at him. James was 34, hardly decrepit, and the most dependable man she'd ever known. He ironed his shirts on Sunday evenings and kept a spare umbrella in every coat pocket. He didn't have crises. He had carefully planned responses to potential difficulties. The next morning, she retraced his likely route. The bookshops along Aldgate knew him well. Mr. Whitmore, the quiet gentleman who always paid in cash and never haggled. At Morrison's Rare Books, the proprietor remembered seeing him around 3 o'clock. "Headed toward Pemberton's, I think," the man said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Though I can't imagine why. That place has been closed for months." Eleanor found Pemberton's Curiosities sandwiched between a curry house and a shop selling mobile phone accessories. The windows were papered over from the inside, and a faded "To Let" sign hung askew from the upper floor. But when she pressed her face to the glass of the front door, she could see footprints in the dust on the floor, fresh ones leading toward the back of the shop. She tried the door handle, locked, of course. The police were less than helpful. James Whitmore was an adult, they reminded her. Adults were allowed to disappear if they chose to. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of financial difficulties, no history of mental illness. These things usually sorted themselves out, they assured her. Eleanor spent the week in a fog of growing panic. She called in sick to her job at the university library and instead haunted the streets around Aldgate, showing James's photograph to shopkeepers and passers-by. A few remembered seeing him, but no one had seen him leave. On Saturday morning, she found herself back at Pemberton's, staring at the papered windows as if they might yield some clue. The curry house next door was just opening, and the owner, a middle-aged Bengali man with kind eyes, noticed her standing there. "You looking for someone?" he asked. Eleanor showed him James's photograph. The man nodded slowly. "I remember him. Tuesday afternoon, yes. He was standing right here, looking at this shop. Very interested in it, he was." "Did you see him go inside?" The man frowned. "That's the strange thing. Shop's been closed since summer, but I could have sworn I saw the door open, just for a moment, like someone had let him in." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Are you certain?" "Well, no, not certain. Was busy with the lunch rush, wasn't I? But—" he gestured at the door. "Funny thing is, I walked past later that evening, and I could have sworn I heard voices inside, like people talking, very quiet." That night, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, James's side of the bed cold and empty beside her. She'd already changed the sheets twice, unable to bear the fading scent of his cologne on the pillowcase. 7 days. In all their years together, James had never been away for more than a single night without calling her. She was just drifting off to sleep when she heard the key in the front door. Eleanor bolted upright, her heart hammering. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. She heard footsteps in the hallway, familiar footsteps, the slightly uneven gait from an old rugby injury that made James favor his left leg. "James!" she called out, her voice cracking. The footsteps paused. Then softly, "Eleanor? I'm home." She found him standing in the kitchen, still wearing the same clothes he'd disappeared in, Dark jeans, navy jumper, the brown leather jacket she'd given him for Christmas. He looked exactly as he had a week ago. No signs of where he'd been or what he'd endured. Eleanor threw her arms around him, breathing in the familiar scent of his aftershave. He felt solid, real, warm. But when she pulled back to look at his face, something made her stomach clench. His eyes were wrong. Not the color. They were still the same warm brown she'd fallen in love with. Not the shape or size. But there was something different in his expression. Something distant and careful, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Where have you been?" she whispered. "I've been so worried. The police, they wouldn't listen. But I knew something had happened to you." James looked at her for a long moment before answering. I can't remember." "What do you mean you can't remember?" "It's all very fuzzy. I remember going to Aldgate, and then—" He rubbed his temples. "And then I was walking up our street, and I realized I had my keys in my hand." Eleanor searched his face for signs of deception, but James had never been a good liar. The few times he'd tried to surprise her, birthdays, their anniversary, his tells were obvious. The way he avoided eye contact, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Now he looked directly at her with those strange, careful eyes. "You've been gone for a week, James. 7 days. Do you remember nothing at all?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry. I know you must have been frightened." The apology felt formal, distant. Eleanor had expected tears, explanations, desperate embraces. Instead, James stood there as if he were a polite stranger offering condolences. "Are you hurt? Are you ill? Should we go to hospital?" "No," he said quickly. "No, I feel fine. Just tired. Perhaps we should go to bed." In the morning, Eleanor woke to find James already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea. He was perfectly still, staring out at the garden with an expression she couldn't read. "Sleep well?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He startled at her touch, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Yes. Very well." But Eleanor had been awake half the night, listening to him toss and turn. Several times she'd thought she heard him talking, soft murmurs as if he were having a conversation with someone. When she'd asked who he was talking to, he'd claimed to be talking in his sleep. Over the next few days, the wrongness became more apparent. James went through the motions of his normal routine, but it was like watching an actor who'd learned the part but hadn't quite grasped the character. He made his tea too strong, forgot to add milk. He picked up books and set them down without reading, as if he couldn't remember why he'd wanted them. He spent long minutes staring at photographs on the mantelpiece, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Most disturbing of all were the mirrors. Eleanor first noticed it on Thursday morning. She was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when she realized James was standing in the doorway behind her, watching her in the mirror above the sink. But when she turned to smile at him, he was gone. "James!" she called, but he was downstairs making breakfast, humming softly to himself. That evening, she was reading in the sitting room when she caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror above the fireplace. James was standing there, but his reflection seemed to be moving independently, turning its head to look at things that weren't there. When she looked directly at James, he was perfectly still, absorbed in his newspaper. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. He looked up, and for just a moment, his expression was completely blank. Then he smiled, the same smile she'd fallen in love with, but somehow hollow. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "You seem different since you came back." "Different how?" Eleanor struggled to find the words. How could she explain that he felt like a stranger wearing her husband's face? That he made love to her with technical proficiency but without passion? That he no longer absently hummed the James Bond theme while shaving, or left coffee rings on the furniture, or told her ridiculous jokes that made her groan and laugh in equal measure? "You don't seem like yourself," she said finally. James folded his newspaper with precise, careful movements. "Perhaps you're still upset about my disappearance. That's understandable. James, you were gone for a week with no explanation. Of course I'm upset. Then perhaps we should see someone." A counselor. Eleanor stared at him. The James she'd married would have pulled her into his arms, would have apologized again and again, would have talked through her fears until she felt better. This James offered practical solutions like he was troubleshooting a broken appliance. "I think you should see someone," she said. "A doctor. There might be something wrong with your memory." For just an instant, something flickered across his face. Fear? Anger? But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "If you think that's best," he said. Dr. Sarah Chen was a neurologist at University College Hospital, a woman Eleanor's age with intelligent eyes, and a direct manner that Eleanor found reassuring. James submitted to the examination with patient cooperation, answering questions and following instructions like a particularly well-behaved child. "The physical examination is completely normal, doctor," Chen told them afterward. "Reflexes, coordination, cognitive function, everything appears to be within normal parameters." "But the memory loss," Eleanor began, "is not uncommon after traumatic experiences," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "The mind sometimes protects itself by blocking out events that are too difficult to process. The memory may return gradually, or it may not return at all." "So there's nothing wrong with him?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "Nothing that shows up on our tests. But—" She looked at James, who was studying a painting on the wall with the same careful attention he gave everything now. "Mr. Whitmore, do you feel like yourself?" James turned to her with that polite, distant smile. "I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you feel like the same person you were before your disappearance?" "I feel like myself, yes." Eleanor wanted to shout that he wasn't himself, that her husband was gone, and this stranger had taken his place. But how could she explain that to a doctor? How could she say that the man she'd married left coffee rings on the furniture and sang off-key in the shower, and this imposter was too careful, too neat, too polite? That night she woke to find James's side of the bed empty. She found him in the sitting room, standing in front of the mirror above the fireplace. He was perfectly still, but his reflection was moving, gesturing as if it were having an animated conversation with someone she couldn't see. Eleanor rubbed her eyes, certain she was dreaming, but when she looked again, the reflection was still moving independently. She watched in horror as the reflection pointed directly at her, even though James himself was facing away. "James," she whispered. He turned, and for a split second, she saw something terrible in his eyes. Not confusion or recognition, but a kind of cold calculation. Then the familiar, hollow smile returned. "Did I wake you? I'm sorry. I couldn't sleep." "What were you doing?" "Just thinking." Eleanor looked at the mirror, but now it showed only their normal reflections. "Who were you talking to?" "I wasn't talking to anyone." But Eleanor had heard voices, soft murmurs, like people having a conversation in the next room. She was certain of it. The next morning, she called in sick to work and spent the day researching. Memory loss, dissociative disorders, trauma responses. She read everything she could find, looking for an explanation that would make sense of what was happening to her husband. It was while she was searching online that she found the forum. Strange Disappearances, London area was a small community of people sharing stories about missing persons cases that had been dismissed or ignored by authorities. Most of the posts were heartbreaking, families desperately seeking loved ones who'd vanished without trace. But buried in the archives, Eleanor found something that made her blood run cold. Posted by Mary B. 47. "Has anyone heard of people coming back different? My brother went missing in March, came back 2 weeks later with no memory of where he'd been. But he's not the same. He doesn't recognize his favorite foods, doesn't remember things we did as children. And his reflection, this sounds mad, but sometimes his reflection doesn't match what he's doing." The post had 3 replies. 2 offered sympathy and suggestions about trauma counseling. The third was different. Posted by Truth Seeker. "This is the 4th case I've seen like this in the past year. All in London, all involving people who disappeared near Aldgate Street. There's something happening there, something connected to an old antique shop. Eleanor's hands were shaking as she clicked on Truth Seeker's profile. The account had been active for 6 months, posting exclusively about missing persons cases and strange returns. The most recent post was from 3 days ago. Another case, James Whitmore, disappeared from Aldgate area, returned after a week. Wife reports personality changes and strange behavior with mirrors. This has to be connected to Pemberton's curiosities. I'm going to investigate. Eleanor stared at the screen. Someone else had noticed James's disappearance. Someone else was connecting it to the antique shop. She scrolled through Truth Seeker's other posts and found a pattern that made her sick with fear. 7 cases in the past year. 7 people who disappeared near Aldgate Street and returned days or weeks later, fundamentally changed. All of them exhibited the same symptoms: memory loss, personality changes, and strange behavior around mirrors. The most disturbing post was from 2 months ago. I've been inside Pemberton's. The shop appears empty, but there's something in the back room. An old mirror covered with a cloth. I couldn't bring myself to look under it. There's something wrong with that place. Something evil. Eleanor printed out everything she could find and spent the afternoon reading. Truth Seeker had been methodical, documenting each case with dates, locations, and witness statements. The pattern was undeniable. People disappeared near Pemberton's curiosities and came back wrong. When James returned from work that evening, Eleanor was waiting for him in the sitting room with all the printed pages spread across the coffee table. "We need to talk," she said. James looked at the papers, and for just a moment, his careful mask slipped. She saw fear in his eyes, raw, animal terror. Then the polite smile returned. "What's all this?" "Information about your disappearance, about other people who've disappeared from the same area." "Eleanor, I don't think this is healthy. Perhaps you should speak to someone." "Look at this," she interrupted, holding up one of the forum posts. "Mary's brother disappeared near Aldgate Street. When he came back, he was different, just like you." James sat down slowly, his movements careful and controlled. People process trauma differently. "His reflection didn't match his movements," Eleanor continued, "just like yours." James was very still now, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that whatever happened to you in that shop, you didn't come back alone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then James smiled, the same hollow smile he'd worn since his return. "That's quite an imagination you have, Eleanor. Perhaps we should both see someone about this obsession of yours." But Eleanor had seen the fear in his eyes. Whatever was wearing her husband's face, it knew she was getting close to the truth. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's reflection moving independently in the mirror, pointing at her with cold recognition. When she finally dozed off near dawn, she dreamed of voices whispering in languages she didn't understand. She woke to find James already gone, unusual for a Saturday morning. He'd left a note on the kitchen table, "Gone for a walk, back soon. J." The handwriting was perfect, too perfect. James had terrible handwriting, a doctor's scrawl that Eleanor had learned to decipher over years of practice. This note was written in careful, precise letters that looked nothing like his usual script. Eleanor dressed quickly and headed for Aldgate Street. If Truth Seeker was right about the mirror in Pemberton's, she needed to see it for herself. The curry house next door was open, and the same kind-eyed owner who'd spoken to her before was arranging vegetables in the front window. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, approaching him. "The shop next door, Pemberton's, do you know anything about its history?" The man looked up, recognizing her. "Find your husband, did you?" "Yes, but—" Eleanor hesitated. How could she explain her fears to a stranger? "I'm trying to understand what happened to him. He was missing for a week, and now he's different." The man set down a bundle of coriander and gave her his full attention. "Different how?" "He doesn't seem like himself, like someone else is living in his body." To Eleanor's surprise, the man didn't look at her as if she were mad. Instead, he nodded slowly. "My name is Rahman," he said. "Rahman Choudhury, and I think we should talk." He led her inside his restaurant and sat her down at a corner table with a cup of tea that she didn't remember him making. Pemberton's has been trouble for years, Rahman said, settling into the chair across from her. Old Mr. Pemberton, he dealt in strange things. Not just antiques, things that made people uncomfortable. Mirrors mostly, always mirrors. Mirrors? He claimed they were from estate sales, old houses being cleared out. But some of them, Rahman shook his head, some of them felt wrong. Customers would come in to browse and they'd leave quickly, looking disturbed. Said the mirrors made them feel like they were being watched. Eleanor thought of James's reflection moving independently and shivered. Mr. Pemberton died last spring, Rahman continued. Heart attack, right there in his shop. When they cleared out his stock, most of it went to auction. But there was one mirror they couldn't move. Why not? No one would take it. 3 different removal companies refused the job. Said there was something wrong with it, that it made them feel sick to look at. In the end, they just left it there, covered it with a cloth, and locked up the shop. Eleanor leaned forward. Have you seen it? Once. About a month after Mr. Pemberton died, I noticed the shop door was standing open. I went in to check. Thought maybe someone had broken in. The mirror was in the back room, covered with a white sheet. But I could hear things coming from it. What kind of things? Rahman was quiet for a long moment. Voices, he said finally. Like people calling for help, but very faint. And when I got closer, I could see the sheet moving, like there was a breeze underneath it. But there was no wind in that room. Eleanor's tea had gone cold in her hands. Did you look under the sheet? No. Rahman shuddered. Something told me not to. Something told me to get out of there as quickly as possible. I locked the door behind me and called the landlord. He said he'd secure the building properly. But people have still been disappearing. Yes, always near the shop. Always people who were curious about antiques, the sort who might try to get inside. Rahman looked at her with worried eyes. Your husband, he was interested in old things, yes. Eleanor nodded. Books mostly, but he loved browsing antique shops. Then he would have been drawn to Pemberton's. That mirror, it calls to people. I've seen them standing outside the shop, staring at the windows like they're hypnotized. How do you know all this? Rahman sighed. Because I've been watching. Ever since Mr. Pemberton died, I've kept an eye on that shop. I've seen people go in who shouldn't be able to get in, and I've seen them come out changed. Eleanor thought of the forum posts, of truth seekers' methodical documentation. How many others have there been? 7 or 8 over the past few months. They all come back eventually, but they're not the same. Their families notice it immediately. Different mannerisms, different preferences, like someone else is wearing their skin. The restaurant suddenly felt very cold. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her teacup, seeking warmth. There's something else, Rahman said quietly. The people who come back, they're all drawn to mirrors. I've seen them standing outside shop windows, staring at their reflections for hours. And sometimes, he paused as if reluctant to continue. Sometimes what? Sometimes their reflections move wrong, like there's someone else looking back. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. I need to get into that shop. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think that's wise. My husband is trapped in there, isn't he? The real James, and whatever came back, it's not him. Rahman studied her face for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Mr. Pemberton gave these to me years ago, he said. Asked me to keep an eye on the place when he was away. I never gave them back after he died. Eleanor stared at the keys. They looked ordinary enough. An old brass Yale key and a smaller one that might fit a cash register or filing cabinet. But holding them felt like holding a live wire. Are you certain about this? Rahman asked. Eleanor thought of the stranger wearing her husband's face, of the cold calculation in his eyes, of the way he made love to her with technical precision but no emotion. I have to know the truth, she said. Rahman nodded slowly and handed her the keys. Be careful, and if you see that mirror, don't look at it directly. Not until you're ready for what you might see. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the door wanted to be opened. Eleanor stepped into Pemberton's Curiosities and immediately understood why the removal companies had refused to work here. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and carried a smell like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, filtering through the papered windows, but they moved in patterns that defied the still air, spiraling upward in perfect helixes, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving. The main room was largely empty, just a few pieces of furniture too heavy or worthless to be worth moving. But Eleanor could see footprints in the dust on the floor. Several sets, including a pair that looked like they might belong to James's size 10 boots. She followed the footprints toward the back of the shop, her own steps unnaturally loud in the thick silence. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but underneath that sound, she could hear something else. A low humming, like electricity running through old wires. The back room was smaller than she'd expected, with no windows and only a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a mirror. Even covered with a white sheet, it was clearly no ordinary looking glass. The frame was massive, carved from some dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols were etched into the wood, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something that hurt to look at directly. The sheet covering the mirror moved gently, as if stirred by a breeze that Eleanor couldn't feel. And from underneath it came the sound Rahman had described. Voices, faint but unmistakably human, calling out in what sounded like desperate whispers. Eleanor approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The voices grew clearer as she got closer, and she began to make out individual words. "Help us. Please. Don't let them take our place." With trembling hands, Eleanor reached for the edge of the sheet. The fabric felt wrong against her fingers. Too smooth, too cold, like touching a snake's skin. She pulled the sheet away. The mirror's surface was cracked down the middle, a jagged line that split the glass like lightning. But it still showed a reflection, not of Eleanor or the room she stood in, but of somewhere else entirely. The other side looked like a distorted version of the shop, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in mirrors of all shapes and sizes, and in each one, Eleanor could see a face. People trapped behind the glass, pressing their hands against the surface, mouths open in silent screams. And there, in the largest mirror directly across from where she stood, was James. The real James, not the careful imposter who had taken his place. His hair was disheveled, his clothes torn, and his eyes were wide with fear and desperation. When he saw Eleanor, he pressed both hands against the glass and mouthed her name. "James!" Eleanor reached toward the mirror, but her hand stopped inches from the surface, as if she'd hit an invisible barrier. James was pointing frantically at something behind her. Eleanor turned to see another figure approaching in the mirror world, a figure that looked exactly like her, but with cold, predatory eyes. The Eleanor thing smiled and placed its hand against the glass from the other side. For a moment, the barrier wavered, and Eleanor felt an immense pulling sensation, as if the mirror were trying to drag her through. She stumbled backward, breaking the connection. In the mirror world, Eleanor pressed its face against the glass, its expression twisting with frustration. Now Eleanor understood. The mirror was a doorway between worlds, and something on the other side was stealing people, sending copies back to take their places. James was trapped there, and she was next. But as she watched, the real James was fighting his way closer to the main mirror, pushing past other trapped souls. He reached the glass and began frantically gesturing, trying to communicate something urgent. Eleanor pressed her face close to the mirror, trying to understand. James was pointing to the crack in the glass, then to something off to one side. He mouthed words that Eleanor slowly began to decipher. "Break the mirror." Eleanor looked around the room and spotted an old iron poker leaning against the fireplace. She grabbed it, feeling its reassuring weight in her hands. But as she raised it toward the mirror, James suddenly began shaking his head frantically, his mouth forming the word, "Wait." He pointed behind Eleanor. She turned to see her own reflection in a smaller mirror on the wall, but it wasn't moving with her. The reflection, Eleanor was smiling and walking closer to the glass, even though Eleanor herself was standing perfectly still. "You can't destroy us," the reflection said, its voice coming from somewhere inside Eleanor's own head. "We're part of you now. We know everything you know, feel everything you feel. We're more real than you are." Eleanor raised the poker toward the small mirror, but her reflection self laughed. "Break that one and another will appear. We're in every reflective surface now. Every window, every puddle, every piece of polished metal. You can't escape us." "What do you want?" Eleanor whispered. "To live," the reflection replied. "To feel sunlight and taste food and love and laugh and do all the things you take for granted. Your world is so much richer than ours, so much more alive." Eleanor looked back at the main mirror, where James was still pressed against the glass, shaking his head desperately. "If I break the mirror, will they be free?" "Some of them," her reflection admitted, "but not all. And we'll fight you. We'll use your own strength against you." Eleanor felt a strange doubling sensation, as if she were both in the room and watching herself from outside. The reflection was trying to take control, to stop her from destroying the mirror. With immense effort, she forced herself to move toward the cracked mirror. Each step felt like walking through thick honey, and she could hear her own voice pleading with her to stop, to let things remain as they were. "James has a good life here," the reflection whispered. "We'll take care of it for him. We'll love you just as much as he did. More even. We'll never argue or disappoint you or grow old and sick. We'll be perfect." Eleanor raised the poker, her arms shaking with the effort of fighting against her own reflected will. "Perfect isn't real," she gasped. She brought the poker down on the cracked mirror with all her strength. The mirror exploded in a shower of silver fragments, each piece catching the light like a falling star. The sound was enormous, not just the crash of breaking glass, but something deeper and more fundamental, like reality itself tearing apart. Eleanor was thrown backward by a shock wave that seemed to come from inside her own body. For a moment, the world went completely white, and she felt herself falling through space that had no up or down, no beginning or end. When her vision cleared, she was lying on the floor of the back room, surrounded by glittering shards of mirror. The frame stood empty, its dark wood now nothing more than an ornate picture frame containing empty air. Eleanor struggled to her feet, her ears ringing. The oppressive atmosphere of the shop was gone, replaced by ordinary stuffiness and the smell of old wood and dust. The humming sound had stopped, and the dust motes were settling naturally instead of dancing in impossible patterns. "Eleanor?" She turned to see James standing in the doorway. The real James, with disheveled hair and torn clothes and eyes full of love and concern instead of cold calculation. Eleanor threw herself into his arms, and this time he felt right. Warm and solid and wonderfully, imperfectly human. He smelled like fear and old dust, and beneath that, faintly, of his usual aftershave. "Are you hurt?" he asked, holding her tightly. "I saw you fall." "I'm fine. How do you feel?" James pulled back to look at her, and she saw her husband clearly for the first time since his return. His eyes were warm brown instead of cold and careful, and when he smiled, it reached all the way to the corners of his eyes. "Like myself," he said simply. "Like I've been sleeping for a week and just woke up." They picked their way carefully through the broken glass and out of the shop. Eleanor locked the door behind them and handed the keys back to Rahman, who was waiting anxiously outside his restaurant. "Is it finished?" he asked. Eleanor looked back at the shop where the papered windows showed nothing but ordinary darkness. "I think so." But as they walked away, she caught a glimpse of their reflection in the window of the mobile phone shop, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw extra figures walking behind them, shadow shapes that moved independently, watching them with hungry eyes. She blinked, and the reflections were normal again. 6 months later, Eleanor and James were having breakfast in their Bloomsbury flat. The morning sun streaming through windows that Eleanor had gotten into the habit of cleaning obsessively. James was reading the newspaper and humming the James Bond theme under his breath, a habit that had returned gradually along with his other small imperfections. He left coffee rings on the furniture again. He sang off-key in the shower. He told terrible jokes that made Eleanor groan and laugh in equal measure. He was wonderfully, perfectly imperfect, and Eleanor had never loved him more.